Thanks very much. I'm really excited to be in Dublin. It's the first time I've ever been to the city, so that's great. I was walking to the hotel today and I passed Jim Larkin's statue. Jim Larkin was someone I was brought up politically to revere, so that was a great moment already to see, to go past that. I'm just setting the recording button here. Okay, who are you listening to? A 30-year left-wing, non-Jewish, non-Israeli, two states for two people Zionist. Pro-Israel, pro-Palestine, pro-peace. 20 years an academic, a professor of politics. For the last 3, I've been founder and editor of this journal, Fathom. The interview I did with Leo Amahai of Settlement Watch was the most read item at our website last time that I looked. What's tonight's debate actually about? It's not about whether or not you support the latest settlement announcements in East Jerusalem. Like Yael Lapid and Zippy Livni, I oppose them. It's not about whether you think Moshe Feiglin walking up to the Temple Mount is a good idea. Like Illan, I think it's incitement. It's not about that. It's about which paradigm for achieving Palestinian statehood you support, the peace process paradigm or the boycott paradigm. And it's also about that Palestinian state that will sit alongside Israel, or will it be instead of Israel? Two states for two peoples, or the so-called one-state solution. That's what it's really about. On our side of the debate, my side of the debate, we think Palestinian statehood will be achieved by dialogue, deep mutual recognition, engagement, the development of trust, not just between the parties, but the peoples, excruciating compromise, and the division of the land. A state of Palestine alongside the state of Israel. My opponents will speak for themselves, but I think they are for Palestinian statehood being achieved by delegitimizing Israel and boycotting Israel. And crucially, their Palestinian state will replace Israel. Palestine instead of Israel. So that's your choice. Palestine alongside Israel by negotiations, or Palestine instead of Israel by boycotts. That's what I think the debate's about. I think the other side will tell you that the boycott paradigm is needed because the peace process paradigm has failed, or even that it was always a fraud. It isn't. They will say that no progress has been made with the peace process paradigm. It has. Huge progress. Contacts made, differences clarified, gaps closed. The two sides came very close at Annapolis to a deal. I've spoken to people on the side of the most recent John Kerry-led process. Real substantive talks took place. Progress was again made. They didn't make it. They may tell you that no one supports the peace process paradigm anymore. In fact, the truth is, everybody supports the peace process paradigm except them. And I really do mean everybody. The United States, the European Union, the UN, the Arab League, which amended its peace initiative to accept the principle of land swaps under John Kerry's urging. Both leaderships, and crucially, and this is bedrock, both peoples still support two states for two peoples. They may say that Israel is basically South Africa, so you should boycott it like we boycotted apartheid. No, it's not. The differences are huge and crucial if you're considering strategy as a solidarity movement. Israel-Palestine is a national conflict which requires separation. The land has to be divided between two peoples to create two distinct nation-states. It isn't a racial struggle between two component parts of one nation which need to be brought together on the basis of democracy, one person, one vote. That's why Noam Chomsky calls the South African analogy, quote, a very dubious one, and warns against a strategy based upon it. It's why Uri Avneri, a veteran Israeli peace campaigner, one of the first to make contact with Arafat, says the mistaken assumption that the Israeli-Palestine conflict resembles the South African experience leads to a mistaken choice of strategy. Look, it's right to criticize Israel. I edit a journal that criticizes Israel every quarter. It's a nation-state, not a deity. Nation-states are clumsy, blundering, bureaucratic things. Of course, it should be criticized. But if you support, as I think your upper house does, two states for two peoples, then on that basis, I ask you to reject the idea of boycotts, because boycotts won't get you to that goal. They'll take you away from that goal, and now I'll try and explain why that's the case. I'm going to make 4 claims about boycotts. First, they get wrong what the conflict is actually about. Second, they're counterproductive. Third, they're unfair. And 4, there's a better, more progressive alternative. No one has come here tonight to tell you to ignore the conflict, to be quiet about it, and not to do anything. First claim, the proposal gets wrong what the conflict's about. It's simple-minded. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is best understood as an unresolved national question between two peoples, both Europe's victims, both of whom have legitimate democratic claims for national self-determination in a sovereign nation-state, but who have so far failed to divide the land between them. Negotiations to do so came close, but ultimately failed at Camp David in 2000, Tabor in 2001, Annapolis in 2007-8, and most recently in the John Kerry talks. They will get back to the table. So think about what you have here, and then think about the blunt instrument of a boycott and see if they match up for you. What you have is an unresolved national question, a tangled history, each people clinging to a narrative that contradicts the others at crucial points, huge political complexity, diplomatic complexity too, security challenges, Arab states falling, jihadi armies rising, and all the while fear and resentment that have been bred bone deep that must be overcome. Trust has to be built. Engagement has to be encouraged. Deep mutual recognition has to be secured. Compromises have to be agreed. All of that has to happen if we're to divide the land. Now, into all of that complexity steps BDS. And it's got a proposition for you, that the way to cut through all of that complexity, to build all of that trust, to get over all of that tangled history, is to do what? To exclude Israelis, and only Israelis, from the economic, cultural, sporting, and academic life of humanity. To put it at its mildest, it's an unlikely proposition. It has one claim, I think, on serious people, which is the idea that Israel holds peace in the palm of its hand, and it just won't give it up. So we need coercion of a non-violent kind to make it give it up. That's a fundamental misunderstanding of the conflict. Israel's already agreed to give it up, to divide the land. It agreed to do that in 1936 when the Peel Commission proposed it. It agreed to that in 1947 when the UN proposed it. In 1967, it proposed land for peace. In 2000 at Camp David and at Annapolis, it proposed again to divide the land. That's not the problem. The problem is Israel is not obliged to commit national suicide. Therefore, it wants to negotiate some things. It wants to negotiate security guarantees, negotiate recognition, negotiate that this actually is an end of claims, so that what you get is two states for two peoples living alongside each other in peace, a two-state solution, not a two-stage solution in which the high ground, the hills of the West Bank, looking down on Israel's population centres, become the launching pad for terror against its people. So myth number one, I think, is that what the conflict is actually about. It's a national question which needs resolution through negotiation. Second claim, boycotting Israeli academics will be counterproductive if what you want is two states for two peoples. First, because it will only create a sense of siege within Israel, reinforcing reactionary trends in Israeli society. That's why Noam Chomsky calls the proposal a gift to Israeli hardliners. The proposal damages the peace camp in Israel because it demonizes all Israelis indiscriminately and Israelis uniquely. This is not a first of a series, this meeting. You're not meeting again next week and the week after about which other academics you're going to boycott around the world. It's just Israelis. That's why the New Israel Fund, a major leftist NGO in Israel working for a shared society between Jews and Arabs, says we see global BDS as a tactic that embodies the message that Israel cannot and will not change itself, and for that reason we think it's inflammatory and counterproductive. It's why Gideon Levy, a violent critic of the Israeli government, a journalist at Haaretz, says nonetheless boycotts will only make Israeli society more nationalistic, more frightened and less willing to compromise. It's counterproductive because it strengthens extremists and weakens moderates on both sides. It condemns peacemakers as collaborators through its anti-normalization strategy, and that's why the Palestinian president, Mahmoud Abbas, opposes a boycott of Israel. I should repeat that. The Palestinian president, Mahmoud Abbas, opposes a boycott of Israel. He said, significantly in South Africa in 2013, quote, "We do not want to boycott goods coming from Israel. We do not ask anyone to boycott Israel itself. We have relations with Israel. We have mutual recognition of Israel." Counterproductive because it threatens academic freedom and exchange. Boycotts stop the flow of ideas and stop collaboration between institutions. That's why Edward Said was not in support of boycotts. That's why he said, "I believe it's our duty as Palestinians, and yes, even as Arab intellectuals, to engage Israel's academic and intellectual audiences by lecturing at Israeli centres." He asked a question, what have years of refusing to deal with Israel done for us? He answered it, nothing at all except to weaken us. Counterproductive also because, whether deliberate or not, I'm sure 95% of the time it's not deliberate, but just as a matter of simple observable fact, BDS campaigns have sometimes incubated an environment that has been hostile to Jews, not just to Israelis. So when a Birmingham BDS activist recently wrote of a successful supermarket protest, they said it went really well. We filled a massive trolley, loads of kosher stuff. It's the case that a demonization of Israel produces a normalization of some old anti-Semitic ways of viewing the world. The idea of the Jewish conspiracy, the idea that Jews always act in bad faith, the exclusion of Jews and only Jews from the public square, and more relentless, and boy do I mean relentless, Holocaust inversion. You know the kind of thing I mean. Netanyahu can never appear unless he morphs into Hitler, the IDF into the SS, Jenin or Sajir into Warsaw. That which was previously said of the Jew, the stereotypical Jew, that they're always starting wars, pulling the financial strings, controlling the media, making Gentile politicians into their puppets, is now often heard of Israel, or at least the peculiarly demonic version of Israel that one finds in much BDS discourse, and counterproductive because it harms Palestinian workers. Yes, SodaStream recently relocated from the West Bank to Israel, partly because of BDS pressure. A result? Well, not for the 500 Palestinian workers who are now unemployed or their families. The salaries they were on were 3 to 4 times the Palestinian average, had pensions and medical schemes, and they didn't want it. It was every opportunity to listen to one SodaStream Palestinian worker after another saying they did not want a boycott of the factory, they did not want to lose their jobs, and the BDS movement didn't listen to it. Third, as Israeli civil society and the Israeli government are two separate things. We do this for every other country in the world. We separate out our critique of civil society and our relationship to it from our critique and relationship to government. That's what we should do here too. My opponents tonight may say academia in Israel is a branch of the government. It isn't, and I've got a host of facts and figures, if we get to it in the Q&A, to argue that out. Israeli academics are traditionally amongst the most liberal, most pro-two states, most likely to be campaigning for a shared society, most likely to be reaching out to Palestinians of any group in Israel. That's why Sari Nusabeh, when he was president of Al-Quds University, a Palestinian, said, in opposing boycotts, he said, it's within the academic community I find most progressive pro-peace views, people seeing us as equals. If you want to punish any sector, that's the last one to approach. Unfair because it's a double standard. You're proposing to exclude Israeli Jews and only Israeli Jews from the academic life of humanity. Noam Chomsky says, does that pass the glass houses test? If Tel Aviv University is being boycotted because Israel violates human rights at home, why not boycott Harvard? Because of greater violations by the US. If Israeli academics are being held accountable for the actions of their state, and no other academics in the world are held similarly accountable, you need to ask yourself whether that's something you want to support. Unfair also because the leadership of the BDS movement, and I stress leadership, and these are the words of Norman Finkelstein, the anti-Zionist writer, but crucially the two-stater, says of the BDS movement that they want to eliminate Israel. Listen to him and not my words. I think he's directly addressing my opponents tonight. This is what Norman Finkelstein said. I won't do the Brooklyn accent. You can't answer the Israelis when they say BDS seeks to eliminate Israel because it's true. It's not an accident that BDS doesn't mention Israel. You know that, and I know that. I'm sick of it. Are you going to reach the Israeli public with a message of they want to destroy us? No. And you know what? You shouldn't. At least be honest. Say we want to destroy Israel, and this is our strategy for doing it. But this duplicity and this disingenuousness, oh, we're agnostic about Israel, you say. You're not. You're not agnostic. You don't want it. Just say it. You don't, because you know that if you do, you don't have a prayer of reaching a broad public. Fourth claim, there's better ways to be for the Palestinians, to be involved in this issue from Dublin or London or Rome or Paris or Berlin or anywhere else than to be for boycotts. I haven't come here to ask you to sit idly by. The alternative to boycotts is to encourage and assist all efforts towards dialogue, engagement, deep mutual recognition and a culture of peace. People can decide whether that means they're going to be for Palestinian nation building. Great. It could be that you're for the Israeli peace camp. Great. It could be that you're for a shared society and you put yourself into those organisations which build that. And there's lots of them. One Voice, Parents Circle Family Forum, Centre for a Shared Society, which Mohammed Darawshe runs and which I featured in the new Fathom and interviewed, and I worked with him. You could do all of that. You could get behind trade union solidarity. Do you know that the PGFTU, the Palestinian Union, and the Histadrut, the Israeli Union, signed an agreement in 2008? Do you know that it was brokered by the ITUC and every global federation in the world? Do you know that when Unison sent over a delegation in 2010 and asked the PGFTU, asked the Palestinian trade unionists, do you want us to boycott? They came back and they wrote in their report, all the organisations we met during the delegation, including the PGFTU, none of them called on Unison to sever its relations with the Histadrut. In fact, the opposite. And what did the Palestinian Human Rights Monitoring Group say in 2010 about that relationship, about the consequences of that engagement with the Israeli trade unions? Quote, the rights of the Palestinian workers have been strengthened over the last 2 years with increased cooperation. Challenge Israel for sure, but don't infantilise or romanticise the Palestinians. Be willing to challenge both sides. When, on the Palestinian national movement, you see rejectionism, terrorism, authoritarianism, corruption, the promotion of a culture of incitement, demonisation and anti-Semitism, oppose those things too, as strongly as you oppose settlements, for instance. I think, and this is the last point, we stand at a crossroads for how Westerners are going to make solidarity or going to be involved in this conflict. I think there's two ways forward. You could follow Illan Pappe, who has said, I want to devote my energies to delegitimising the state of Israel. So note what he's not saying. He's not saying, I want the occupation to end. He's not saying, I want a Palestinian state alongside Israel, because he doesn't. He wants to delegitimise the state of Israel. And that's absolutely his right, but you're not obliged to tag along with him. You could decide there's a better way to go. You could decide that Nelson Mandela has a better approach. What did Mandela have to say about the conflict? He said this, as a movement, we recognise the legitimacy of Palestinian nationalism just as we recognise the legitimacy of Zionism as a Jewish nationalism. He goes on, we insist on the right of Israel to exist within secure borders. He gets security. But equally, with equal vigour, we support the Palestinian right to national self-determination. So he gets the fact that the occupation must end urgently. How does he propose to do it? We're gratified to see that new possibilities of resolving the issue through negotiation have arisen. We would wish to encourage the process and, if possible, assist it. My case is that's what we should want to do too. We should follow that road. We should be in favour, like Mandela, of looking for, searching out chances to encourage and assist. And on that basis, I'd ask you to please reject the idea of boycott. Thank you.